Thank you, David. Between 2002 and 2008, I served as a non-executive director of AIB, and for most of my term I was also a member of the board's audit committee and the board's remuneration committee. So, as you can see, I tick all the boxes that you don't want to be ticking at this stage in our economy's existence. My saving grace is that between 2007 and 2009, I was a member of the supervisory board of AIB's Polish subsidiary, Bank Zachodni Łubica, which is still making good profits, is still solvent, and has a great future. I suppose what I have to say to you this evening will betray some sympathy for the position of non-executive directors. I don't think you can spend 6 or 7 years in that role without developing an understanding of the constraints within which non-executive directors operate and the mostly conscientious efforts that they make to fulfil their duties. Having said that, I'm not speaking today on anybody else's behalf but my own, and it certainly isn't my intention to present to you an apologia for banks and their boards. Serious mistakes were made by banks during the boom years. The consequences of those mistakes have been horrendous, and the primary responsibility for them lies with banks and their boards. And nothing that I have to say is designed to evade that or downplay it. The main purpose of my remarks is probably a little narrow. It's to try and shed light on 2 questions. One is, how can bank boards, comprised as they are of intelligent, experienced people, many of whom have earned big reputations for wisdom and sound judgment, have presided over institutions that committed such disastrous errors? And the second question that I will address, albeit less fully, is what changes might be made to the way banks are run in order to minimise the risk that recent experience will be repeated. I'd like to start by saying that a critical impediment that has to be overcome in the delivery of good corporate governance outcomes, or in plain speech, in ensuring that companies are run well, is asymmetry of information. Simply put, management has much more information about the company's affairs than do boards, and non-executive directors in particular. And ultimately, the board is given as much information as management is prepared to share with it. By information, I don't just mean raw data. I also mean the wherewithal to interpret the data intelligently. And I don't only mean the kind of information that's amenable to quantification or communication in discrete form, because some information that is crucially important to understanding how a firm operates, such as information about the culture of the firm, can only be gleaned by continuous observation over a period of time, and that sort of engagement is not possible for a non-executive director. Therefore, even in a setting where management is relatively open and where boards are enabled to comprehend the relatively large amount of shared data, there will be potentially important gaps in the information that directors have. The existence of this problem, this asymmetric information problem, means that trust is crucial. And I would suggest that in an important sense, trust is a big part of the answer to the first of the questions that I've set out to answer. In fact, pressed to identify the overarching reason for bank boards, if you will, going with the flow during the boom years, I would say it was that the directors placed too much trust in management. That's not offered as a formula for exonerating boards. Boards of directors are ultimately responsible for the running of the business. The fact that they delegate the task to management doesn't change that. But it does mean that the exercise of judgment in the matter of who to trust and to what degree is an absolutely critical aspect of the non-executive director's role. Besides, of course, a reserve power of boards is the appointment of the CEO, and that's probably the single most important decision that a board will take. Given their dependence on the information flow coming from management, non-executive directors actually spend a good deal of their time assessing the trustworthiness of their executives. The more evidence there is that the executives are open and truthful, are lucid in their presentations, and display a command of detail, can answer questions without hesitation, the more they will be trusted. And because boards cannot always directly observe how well a company is being run, and in particular whether a company is being run in a sustainable way, there is a tendency to use indicators of management trustworthiness as a proxy measure. And clearly there's a potential pitfall here, because an open, truthful and articulate management team is not necessarily a management team that is running business well. I think one of the lessons from all of this is that non-executive directors have to be especially mindful of the potentially disarming effect that these admirable qualities have. Let me move on to talk about risk systems. The distinction between a company doing well and a company doing sustainably well is critical. In a banking context, the link between the two dimensions of performance is risk. During the boom years, banks performed spectacularly well in terms of profits and share price growth, but it's now clear, of course, that this performance was bought at the cost of greatly excessive risk-taking. Was the scale of risk-taking reckless? Looking back from a point in the middle of the wreckage, recklessness seems like a reasonable word to use. But of course, this is hindsight bias at work. With hindsight, it's easy to conclude that the catastrophe we're now dealing with was the inevitable consequence of the credit boom that preceded it. And it's but a small step from that proposition to the proposition that those who drove the growth in credit did so in the knowledge that their actions would have disastrous consequences, and thus displayed reckless disregard. But that's not the way the future looked at the time. The prevailing belief during the boom in bank boardrooms and beyond was that the boom would give way to the much vaunted soft landing. Of course, directors were alive to the risk that a much more malign scenario was possible, but they trusted in the systems for measuring, monitoring and controlling risk that had been put in place. They trusted that these systems would ensure that the banks would be adequately protected if those kind of circumstances arose. I think this confidence in risk systems, which we now know was misplaced, had to do in part with the amount of time devoted to risk-related matters by banks and their boards throughout the boom. And I think this was particularly the case with AIB. The Rosenac debacle in 2002 had focused attention on deficiencies in the way the bank dealt with risk, and ushered in a period during which extraordinary efforts were made to transform the way in which the bank dealt with risk. And the board's agenda throughout this period was thickly populated with risk-related items. And this almost certainly conditioned non-executives to believe that the general matter of risk was being well looked after. What about the more specific matter of credit risk and the related issue of capital adequacy? Again, in this area, there was an enormous amount of work being done in banks, thanks to Basel II. This programme of work involved a detailed, sophisticated modelling of credit risk by people with considerable technical expertise. Again, I have to emphasise that I'm not endeavouring to get boards off the hook by blaming risk systems. Systems are designed and operated by people, and bank directors had an explicit role in approving risk management policies and in reviewing risk management practices. But a major weakness of bank governance, as practiced during the boom years, was that boards were not equipped to effectively execute this role, even if they spent a good deal of time addressing these matters, or more accurately, being addressed on these matters. In particular, boards lacked the resources to independently evaluate the adequacy of risk systems. As I've already mentioned, during the boom, the dominant belief amongst bank directors was that the economy would achieve a soft landing, which, defined from a property market point of view, is a situation where values plateau or fall modestly. And even amongst those of us who were sceptical of that scenario, the conviction that a collapse in house prices was likely was not strong, and certainly not strong enough to persuade our boardroom colleagues. Undoubtedly, the sceptics could have, and with the benefit of hindsight should have, articulated their doubts much more insistently. Whether this would have made much difference is something we will never know. But I have to say, for my part, it's a matter of profound personal and professional regret that I wasn't more forceful in setting out the contrarian view and didn't work harder at developing and figuring out its implications. Anyway, reflecting the prevailing wisdom, banks made the soft landing their central case in designing strategy and guiding lending policies, but mindful of the risk that something worse might eventuate, they carried out stress tests that purported to quantify the effects on profitability and on balance sheets of things going badly wrong. Without exception, these stress tests provided assurance that the banks would continue to make profits, even if greatly diminished, and would remain adequately capitalised and liquid. From a methodological point of view, we know now that these stress tests were very seriously flawed. In the first instance, even the worst-case scenarios tested were nowhere near bad enough. Second, the models used greatly underestimated the consequences of a given negative shock because they didn't adequately capture second-round or feedback effects. Thirdly, the models made no attempt that I know of to capture the effects of Irish banks facing the kind of severe funding problems they have encountered on international credit markets. These flaws point to gravely deficient risk measurement. It was not so much that Irish banks were recklessly indifferent to risk, it was more a case that they didn't understand the risks they were taking and were not much assisted in doing so by the tools they were using. Perhaps this distinction will strike some of you as a distinction based on semantics. In any event, there is no doubt that bankers tend to take excessive risks during booms. Part of the explanation is they suffer from myopia. A particular form of myopia that they and others are susceptible to is what's called disaster myopia, the increasing tendency to discount the probability of disaster occurring the longer the interval of time that has elapsed since a disaster last occurred. They also suffer from the conceit, again it's not peculiar to them, that they have learned and applied transformational lessons from earlier disasters. The tendency to myopia and excessive risk-taking is almost certainly reinforced by competitive pressure. The day-to-day business of dealing with the threat from competitors and of defending market share is real, but disaster is an abstraction until it breaks. I think it follows from this that one of the fundamental purposes of a bank board is to protect the bank from the myopia of bankers. Ensuring that robust risk systems are designed and implemented is an essential part of that mission. More generally, insisting that the longer-term and strategic implications of a proposed course of action are fully taken into account before proceeding is another. The evidence suggests that the boards of Irish banks failed badly on this score. Too many management proposals were adopted in response to arguments that were couched primarily or exclusively in terms of what competitors were doing. This line of argument should have been more vigorously challenged. An obvious way in which the myopia of bankers can be amplified or reduced is through remuneration policy, and bank remuneration has rightly come under a critical spotlight. Popular commentary has concluded that personal greed was an important causal factor in the crisis, although I have to say I'm far from convinced that the distribution of greed and other human attributes is any different amongst bank executives than it is amongst executives generally. But in any event, to figure out what role greed might have played, it's necessary to distinguish between two dimensions of remuneration policy, or two dimensions of remuneration. Remuneration levels and the composition of remuneration packages. My own view, for what it's worth, is that popular commentary is driven more by the magnitude of the former, whereas it's the latter that matters from the point of view of incentives. During the boom years, it was common for top bank executives in Ireland to be awarded annual remuneration packages worth several millions of euro. In the eyes of many people, remuneration levels on this scale are scandalous and simply cannot be justified. The justification used by bank boards was that such remuneration packages were required to match the market and remain competitive. And much time and effort was typically expended on unearthing information about pay practices amongst peer companies in order to establish what the market rates were. Remuneration consultants were appointed to carry out such research and generously remunerated for doing so. The thought that the dynamic released by this kind of endeavour was akin to a dog chasing its own tail did not much diminish the earnestness with which the research results were parsed and analysed. The risks of losing a key senior fellow, a key senior figure, however small in objective terms, or alienating able and ambitious young executives because of an overly parsimonious approach to pay, were perceived to be too big to take. However, the need to match the market, however defined, and even if granted, can only be regarded as a proximate justification for very high pay levels. The ultimate justification for remuneration packages amounting to high double-digit multiples of the average industrial wage has to be that the recipients are extraordinarily valuable in terms of the rare combination of talents that they bring to their posts and deploy to the benefit of shareholders. This proposition is surely one of the clearest casualties of the financial crisis. With the benefit of hindsight, and maybe even without it, it is hard to avoid the conclusion that senior bankers were seriously overpaid in the boom years. And I put up my hands and say I played a role in bringing that situation about. The point I'm making here has, I believe, a more general application, which I hesitate to explore, but in the spirit of earnest inquiry I will. Greed may be useful, but only up to the point where the outcomes are sustainable. Vast income differentials are politically and socially sustainable in a democratic society, if at all, only in circumstances where a rising tide is lifting all, or at least most boats. There's a kind of social contract implicit in the acceptance of marked income inequality. If those at the top perform incompetently, and more particularly preside over outcomes that are destructive of the welfare of the general population, the terms of that contract are broken. A significant compression of income differentials is, I believe, an inevitable consequence. And if this is not achieved by market forces, there will be pressure on government to bring it about through the tax system. Turning to the issue of the composition of pay packets, the packages of senior bank executives typically included a basic salary, a performance-related bonus, and some sort of long-term incentive component, as well as a variety of other smaller elements. Criticism has been sharply focused on the bonus element on the grounds that it incentivised bankers to pursue short-term profits without adequate regard to the long-term sustainability of those profits. And it has to be said that bank remuneration committees were alive to this risk and sought to mitigate it in a number of ways. And one of the ways in which they did so was by implementing longer-term incentive plans under which executives were granted potentially large amounts of shares in the company, provided certain thresholds relating to share price performance were reached over a multi-year period, typically a 3-year period or a 5-year period. A critical question in the design of such mechanisms is how demanding the thresholds should be. If they're made too demanding, it may become clear to the executives at an early stage that the trigger point in the mechanism is not going to be reached, in which case the scheme loses its purpose and the short-term bonus element in the overall remuneration package assumes a much greater relative importance than was initially intended. This is an example of a well-intentioned measure that can fail. Overall, it would have been better, I think, to have had much smaller short-term performance-related bonuses balanced by long-term incentive mechanisms with less demanding performance thresholds. Finally, a few remarks on what is to be done. The comprehensive failure of the existing system of bank governance to prevent the current crisis poses some big questions. Does the existing system of unitary boards of directors elected by shareholders need to be entirely replaced? More fundamentally, is the current crisis to be seen as the outcome not of institutional failure or deficiencies of organisation, but of human behaviours of the sort that Margaret referred to, such as herd behaviour, that will not be greatly changed, much less eradicated, by the kind of reforms that are feasible in a liberal democracy? I pose some of these questions not because I'm going to offer answers to them, but because they draw attention to the possibility that the problem may not have an enduring solution. In the matter of financial crises, and again this echoes what Margaret Sweeney said, history repeats itself again and again and again, as attested to not only by Margaret but by Reinhardt and Rogoff's recently published and masterful historical study. This time is different, for which I'm on commission. On a rather more optimistic note, the most powerful defence against a repeat of the current crisis, at least in the medium term, by which I mean the next generation or so, is the fact that it has just occurred. The crisis and its consequences will live on in the memory of borrowers and lenders and will loom large in the risk models of the latter for many years to come. The result will be much greater risk aversion and much more highly priced risk than obtained in the boom years. And of course, this draws attention to an important danger in the current climate, namely that in an attempt to solve yesterday's problem of excessive risk-taking, policymakers may exacerbate tomorrow's, which may be excessive risk aversion. Is there a set of reforms to the existing system of governance that offers the prospect of a decisive improvement in the way banks are run? Well, there's been quite an output of reports on this subject over the last year or so, and quite a number of proposals have been put forward to this end. I don't intend to review them in detail. There's been a number of these proposals are clearly designed to address the asymmetry of information problem. The kind of proposals that flow from a recognition of that problem include that boards should have more members with banking and financial experience or expertise, that non-executives should have access to specialist advice independent of bank management, which is an interesting one. There's huge scope, I think, for enhancing arrangements around the governance of risk, and an urgent requirement to do so. And again, quite a number of proposals have been put forward here, like elevating the position of chief risk officer in the bank to a very much more weighty and independent role than it currently enjoys. And of course, there have been a number of proposals in the area of remuneration, including risk adjusting performance, including increased use of deferral of bonuses, and including provision for clawing back bonus payments in circumstances where there's been grievous misstatement or fraud. Advocates of such reforms, and here I conclude, are careful to point out that changes in prescribed standards and procedures on their own will not be sufficient to bring about improvements in governance. And I quote a recent report by Sir David Walker, who carried out a review of corporate governance in UK banks last year. And he makes the point improvement in corporate governance will require behavioural change in an array of closely related areas in which prescribed standards and processes play a necessary but insufficient part. And to that I would add the observation that better corporate governance will not be achieved if non-executive directors do not possess the attribute which above all others is supposed to define them, namely independence of mind and, critically, the courage to demonstrate it. Thank you.